All right, welcome back, everyone. We had some great talks today from two wonderful Sarahs. We had our squirrel talk from Sarah #1, who I'll be asking questions to, and talk about exoplanets and Planets 9 from Planet Sarah, who will be going second, and Rick will be asking her all of the questions. So to start off with, Sarah, you talked about squirrels and trying to understand hibernation from this certain type of ground squirrel. So just kind of an overarching question of, why do animals hibernate? Can you make them hibernate? Can you stop them from hibernating? I know you talked about it a little bit after your talk, but if you could just elaborate and remind us again, that would be great.
Sure. So maybe I can kind of address this question by talking about which animals do hibernate. So the number of animals and the environments that they live in is actually incredibly diverse. So we have things like ground squirrels, hamsters, bears, marmots. So those are the main rodents. And we actually also have non-human primates. So there's some species of lemurs that live in Madagascar, and they actually can enter hibernation as well. So what these animals share in common is an environment where there are periods of severe scarcity, whether that's lack of food, lack of water, or extreme low temperatures. So in the case of ground squirrels, marmots, etc., it's cold temperatures. In the case of the non-hibernating or the hibernating non-human primates, the lemurs, they actually have very dry seasons in Madagascar. So that is the environmental pressure there. So that's what all these animals have in common. In terms of how to make animals hibernate, in terms of that, so there's, like I mentioned in the talk, two main types of hibernation. One that I'll call quote unquote true hibernation. And these animals will hibernate regardless of resources or temperature or et cetera, which sounds kind of contradictory. But what has happened is that evolutionarily, their bodies have developed a physiology. So all the pieces of their body work together to enter and leave hibernation. And this is so hardwired in their physiology that if you give them different resources, they'll still enter hibernation. So those animals, you really can't change their environment to make them hibernate. And it's kind of similar to stopping hibernation. There are some physical limitations, of course. So for example, if we have a squirrel that's hibernating at 40 degrees Celsius, when we move it to a warm room, it will wake up momentarily. So it will not be able to drop its body past room temperature because it can't supercool itself. But it will try to drop its body temperature back to room temperature. So it'll go as far down as possible. So there are limitations on inducing and stopping hibernation for these quote unquote true hibernators.
Okay, so one of the other great questions that came up in my chat room was this question about whether or not the fat cells that you were just talking about, they build up all these fat cells. Do those fat cells also send signals to the brain, kind of like ghrelin and the stomach do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes. These fat cells produce a hormone called leptin. Is what we'd call a satiety hormone, or a hormone that makes you feel full. So the more fat cells you have, the more leptin your body produces, and the vice versa is true. So in theory, the more fat you have, the more full you should feel. And it's a great question because it's actually one possibility that we're exploring in our squirrels. Right before squirrels enter hibernation, they have a lot of fat. And we're thinking maybe they have a lot of leptin and therefore they have a lot of satiety. But the argument against that is that squirrels lose weight throughout hibernation. So actually, after 5 or 7 months of hibernation, they're a very similar weight as to what they were at the very beginning of summer. So basically, they lose all the weight that they gain over the summer. So then you have less fat, less leptin, less satiety, or in other words, more hunger. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and we're actually looking into that for squirrels.
Okay, and on this topic of like molecular communication between things in the body, if you were to either remove the part of the brain that receives like ghrelin signals, or if you were to completely get rid of ghrelin, what kind of effects would that have?
Yeah, so people have tried to ablate or destroy the arcuate nucleus, which I said is the on-off switch of hunger. And actually, the results that they get are kind of confusing because the arcuate nucleus has many different cell types. So the net effect of destroying the arcuate nucleus is actually severe hunger. But if you want to be more targeted, if you take out the neurons that contain the receptors for ghrelin, then you have an animal that is not hungry at all. And people have done this in mice actually genetically. So this has been thought of actually for use as a therapy in humans. Maybe you can create some sort of diet pill or therapeutic that allows humans to feel less hungry. And people have actually already done this. And what they try to do is they introduce another molecule called an antagonist, and this molecule will bind to those ghrelin receptors to prevent ghrelin from activating the arcuate nucleus. And surprisingly, suspensefully, it doesn't do anything. So this was pretty disappointing because people are really excited about this therapy. And our explanation for it is that hunger is something that's innately, we need to eat to survive. So the brain and the body has what we call redundant systems, or systems that work in parallel. So if you knock out one system, there'll be other systems that can take up the slack and do the work. So that's one possibility for why blocking ghrelin in humans does not create a diet pill.
Well, while we're on the topic of humans and everything, I guess the last set of questions has to do with, is it possible for us to make ourselves hibernate? Like, what are some of the things that prevent us from hibernating? And ultimately, you know, if we want to go to Mars, as you mentioned, like, what do you think we would actually have to do in order to do that? Is hibernation the key to help us?
So that's the big question, right? Like, if we want to study these squirrels, we want to relate them to humans. So people have been looking at this for a while, and it seems like human physiology, or the way our bodies work, has limitations that squirrel bodies don't have. So like I said, squirrels can drop their temperature from like 100 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. People have tried to, or scientists, doctors have tried to induce hypothermia in humans, and the most we can really reduce human body temperature is just a few degrees before basically tissue will start to malfunction. Different salts will build up in tissues that will create dysfunction, and basically we can't cool humans that much. The most humans can cool other humans is like a small hypothermia that's actually used in surgery. And this basically slows down metabolism. So open heart surgery is actually quite routine for doctors to chill their patients. In terms of applying hibernation physiology, or what we know from hibernation to humans, one place we'd actually want to look next is bears, because bears are hibernators, but they only drop their body temperature to a moderate degree. So instead of dropping from 100 degrees to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, bears drop from more like 100 degrees to around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And that may be within the limits of human bodies. So that's ultimately the goal, but we have a lot of work to do, and we've learned through studying squirrels that it's really a whole body phenomenon, and you can't just like change one part of the body and expect it to work like it would in a different animal.
Wow, honestly, I would not want to be the researcher doing the research on bears. I like my arms attached to my body. Well, thank you so much for your questions. And I guess last thing, is there any other final thoughts that you want to mention to our listeners?
Yeah, so a few things that crossed my mind through reading some of your questions was, how do animals survive this long without eating? And I actually just want to address that really quickly. And the answer is that not only do they have a lot of stored fat, but they also reduce the energy that their body uses. And this is actually why we want to use this technology in humans, for example, to get to Mars. We want to be able to drop like how fast your heart beats, how quickly you breathe, the metabolism of your cells. So basically, you want to reduce the amount of energy that each of your cells burns to reduce energy requirements. And all these things would basically allow us to give humans or whatever subject less food and allow them to survive for a longer period of time. So we basically want to apply these technologies in that way. But that's going to be quite complex, and we still have a lot of work to go into. And hibernation is a really incredible phenomenon. And like in all my years of studying biology, I've really never interacted with any other animal that has such amazing flexibility in terms of like what its body can do. So if you're interested in hibernation, definitely Google some stuff up. Check out 13-line ground squirrels. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, and I'll pass it over to Rick.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So the squirrels obviously were a big favorite. Everyone loves 13-line ground squirrels. And even if they only had 12 lines, we would still love them just as much. So we had mentioned, so to transition us from squirrels and Mars traveling, and by using the information we can get from hibernation, it doesn't seem like we might be able to apply that to Planet 9 traversal, because it might be around 200 years it takes or so to get there. But Planet 9 is still super interesting, and we're interested in talking to Sarah Millholland to figure out more about that, because you all had a ton of questions that we're interested in getting some answers to. So Sarah, how is it that we know that Planet 9 exists at all? Like, did this story originate as a legend or something like that? Or how are we talking about that right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there actually is some kind of truth in the legend idea, because Neptune was discovered in 1846. And so ever since Neptune's discovery, people have wondered whether maybe there's another planet out beyond Neptune. But this is kind of the first real time that we have a very precise, well-defined hypothesis for another planet with well-defined properties that we think exist. And the reason that we think it exists is because we are observing how these small kind of icy asteroid-like things in the very distant parts of our solar system are behaving strangely. They're all kind of clustering to one side of the sky. And so these astronomers have figured out that maybe a reason that why they're doing this, they're behaving so strangely, is because there's a big planet out there. And we know kind of what it would have to look like in order to produce the strange clustering that we see.
I see. So as with all good scientists, I heard a lot of ifs and maybes, and we think. So if you only think that Planet 9 exists or might exist, then how do you know the size of it?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It kind of like gets at a bigger idea within science, that we have hypotheses that we can't determine yet whether they are correct until we get further evidence that either supports it or refutes it. So we're looking for that further evidence by way of like observing Planet 9 with the telescope. But for now, we can kind of get an estimate on its size by looking at what the properties of those icy asteroid small things are doing. So they kind of cluster in one side of the sky, but they're a little bit spread. They're not like a super, super tight cluster, and they're not random either. And so the amount of clustering that we can see, we can kind of link to how big Planet 9 must be. If Planet 9 was huge, then the other things would just not be stable. They would not even exist. And if it had no mass at all, then it wouldn't be causing them to cluster in the way that we see. So there's kind of this happy medium where we can say this is about how big Planet 9 has to be in order to produce what we see among the objects that we can actually see.
I see. So since so many astronomers have studied the way that celestial bodies move in general, and you know how some planets, their size and how it influences others, you can sort of extrapolate that or make predictions based on those, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's all gravity. It's really cool, actually, that it's all the same force that's keeping us here on Earth. It's this gravity from the sun, gravity from the other planets, and they're all interacting, and it's pretty amazing. But this produces like these weird patterns, like in these Kuiper belt objects. And so by understanding gravity, we can understand like what we expect for Planet 9.
Awesome. So it sounds like a really heavy concept. I like it though. Since we know so much about what we expect Planet 9 to look like, and we've been studying it for several years, or people have been trying to find it, do you have any guesses of how many more years it might take for us to either find out whether we do think it does or does not exist?
Yeah, and I think that's like kind of the million-dollar question that everyone's wondering, is like, how long should we expect to wait for this thing? And I think it's a really hard question to answer, and I don't necessarily have a great idea, but if I were to guess, I would think that within about 10 or maybe 20 years, we should either know whether it is there, like whether we observe it, or whether we can rule it out, and we will have kind of refuted the hypothesis. But for now, it's just really tough, because we know that it's going to be really faint, like a very faint speck of light in the sky, but we don't exactly know how faint. And because that would depend on the properties of the planet itself, like how reflective it is, how much sunlight it reflects off its surface. So even if we do search the whole sky, we won't have known whether we've got as dim of as we can go. So that's why it's tough to answer, but probably like on a decadal timescale is something to think about.
Okay, that makes sense. And just so I make sure I understand where you're getting that estimate from, is that sort of based on statistics of how long it will take to look at the sky and to get a good chance of seeing it, and also advancements in technology? Is that what you're sort of thinking of?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm keeping in mind of like so as in the next coming years there will be some new astronomical surveys, so basically these telescopes that take pictures across the entire sky, and that will take a decade or so to complete. And so I think that will be kind of the next like right now we're just using the telescopes that we have, but there's more coming soon that we will hopefully be kind of definitive as whether it's there or not.
I see. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I really enjoyed learning more about Planet Nine, and it sounds like we have one question from a student that just sort of wanted to know more about some of the planets we do know about our solar system. So, do you happen to know what the fastest orbiting planet in our solar system is, at least of the ones we know for sure exist?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And this is actually a general kind of law that applies to all planetary systems, that it's the closest one that's moving the fastest. So Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, and it takes 88 days to do one trip. So for Earth, it's 365 days. And Mercury, it's 88. So that one's moving the fastest out of all the planets. But it's sort of interesting that in other solar systems, there are planets that are orbit in less than a day. And so those ones are whipping around even faster. So Mercury is kind of slow compared to other planets in other solar systems, but it's fastest in ours.
Interesting. Cool. So not only is Mercury very hot, it is also very fast.
Exactly. Yep.
Cool. Are there any other closing thoughts you had for students that you'd want to share with them?
I guess I just want to share that it's really interesting to think about our solar system as a whole. Like Earth is one planet out of 8 or maybe 9 in our solar system. And if we think about planet 9, we might be thinking about how did our whole solar system form, and why did we get on this rocky, habitable planet that gives us life and squirrels and all the rest. So I think it's kind of cool to think a little bit broader about like how planets form and what's special about ours and what might be special about planets around other stars as well. So I think that's why I do my job, and that's what I kind of would like to leave with everyone.
Awesome. So sparking that curiosity for the next generation of scientists that want to discover Planet 9 and 10, 11, and so on.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot to both Sarahs. We really enjoyed both the planet discussion and the squirrels, and we'll catch everyone next time.
Thanks.